In this video, we'll review Chapter 30, The War to End War, 1917 to 1918. War by Act of Germany. Wilson tried to mediate between two warring sides. January 22nd, 1917, he restated the U.S. commitment to neutral rights and called for peace without victory. Germany responded with a mailed fist. They announced unrestricted submarine warfare on January 31st, and they hoped to defeat the Allies before the United States entered the war. Wilson broke diplomatic relations but moved no closer to war unless overtly pushed by the Germans. This is the presidential electoral map of 1916, showing electoral votes by state. The president asked Congress for authority to arm the merchant ships, but they were blocked by a Senate filibuster. Then came the Zimmermann Note, which was intercepted and published on March 1st, 1917. The German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann secretly proposed a German-Mexican alliance. He tempted the anti-Yankee Mexico also with promises of recovering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the United States was defeated. This was a long-dreaded, overt act in the Atlantic. German U-boats sank 4 unarmed American merchant vessels in the first 2 weeks of March 1917. The revolution in Russia toppled the cruel regime of the Tsars, and America could now fight for democracy on the Allied side without Russian despotism in the Allied fold. So Wilson went before a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and asked for a declaration of war. As a result of British harassment of U.S. commerce, which had been galling but endurable, Germany had also resorted to the mass killing of civilians by this point, and Wilson had drawn the clear line against the depredations of the submarine. In the figurative sense, the war declaration on April 6, 1917, bore the unambiguous trademark "Made in Germany." War, as declared, as German submarines finally forced Wilson's hand, and he asks Congress for a declaration of war, as can be seen in the New York Times headline on April 2nd, 1917. For more than a century, Americans prided themselves on isolation from the Old World. Since 1914, that pride was reinforced by bountiful profits gained through neutrality. 6 senators and 50 representatives, including the first Congresswoman, Jeannette Rankin of Montana, voted against the war resolution. Wilson could incite no enthusiasm by calling on the nation to fight to make the world safe from submarine attacks. Wilson needed to proclaim a more glorified aim. So he shot for the supremely ambitious goal of a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And Wilson virtually hypnotized the nation with his lofty ideals. They contrasted the selfish war aims of other belligerents with America's shining altruism. They preached America did not fight for the sake of riches or territorial conquest, and that the Republic sought to shape the international order in which democracy could flourish without fear of power-crazed autocrats and militarists. This was Wilsonian idealism. This was the personality of the president and the necessities of history, which perfectly matched. He believed the modern world could not afford this hyper-destructive war used by industrial states. He probably had no other argument that would have worked to arouse Americans to this unprecedented burden. But Americans could either be isolationists or crusaders, nothing in between. Wilson's appeal worked, perhaps too well. Holding the torch of idealism, the president fired up the public mind to a fever pitch. Lost was Wilson's earlier plea for peace without victory. So Wilson soon becomes recognized as a moral leader of the Allied cause, and on January 8, 1918, he delivers to Congress his famed 14 points. This was a proposal to abolish secret treaties which pleased liberals of all countries. It also espoused that the freedom of seas should also be protected, and this appealed to Germans and Americans who distrusted British sea power. It also asked or espoused for the removal of economic barriers among nations, which had been a goal of liberal internationalists everywhere. It also called for a reduction of armaments, which was gratifying to taxpayers in all countries, and an adjustment of colonial aims in interests of both the native peoples and the colonizers, which reassured the anti-imperialists. Wilson's pronouncement about the colonies was potentially revolutionary. It helped to delegitimize the old empires and opened the road to eventual independence for millions of subject people. Other points proved to be no less seductive. The hope of independence or self-determination to oppressed minority groups such as the Polish people was very popular. The capstone point, which was point number 14, foreshadowed the creation of the League of Nations, which would be an international organization that would provide a system of collective security. Wilson's points were not applauded everywhere. Some Allied leaders wanted territorial gains, and Republicans mocked the 14 points. Keeping American minds under control and stifling dissent to the war was the next aim on Wilson's mind. And so he created the Committee on Public Information, whose purpose was to mobilize people's mind for war. This was headed by a young journalist named George Creel. His job was to sell America on the war and to sell the world on the Wilsonian war aims. They employed 150,000 workers at home and abroad and sent out 75,000 4-minute men who delivered countless 4-minute speeches containing a lot of patriotic pep. Creel's propaganda took varied forms. There were posters splashed on billboards depicting the Battle of the Fences. Their anti-German propaganda was also created to rally support for the First World War, which most Americans had initially regarded as a European affair. Millions of leaflets and pamphlets contained the most pungent Wilsonisms. They had Hang the Kaiser movies. Songs poured scorn on the enemy and glorified the boys in uniform. There was extensive use of songs, especially George Cohan's Over There. Creel typified the American war mobilization. They relied on more aroused passion and voluntary compliance than on formal laws, and they oversold the ideas of Wilson and led the world to expect too much. The result was eventual disillusionment at home and abroad. This is Patriotic Persuasion, showing a poster where addressing the public's addressing the public's enthusiasm for the war, the government employed all the arts of psychology and propaganda to sustain the martial spirit. So this pre-war song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, was changed to I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Slacker, or I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Sausage, which was certainly something that was degrading to the Germans. German Americans were over 8 million people in the United States, and they were the most proved to be dependably loyal. But there were a few that were tarred, feathered, and beaten, and there was a hysterical hatred of Germans and things Germanic that swept the nation. Orchestras found it unsafe to present German-composed music. German books were removed from library shelves. German classes were canceled. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, and the hamburger became a Liberty steak. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 reflected fears about Germans and anti-war Americans. There were 1,900 prosecutions of anti-war socialists and members of the radical industrial workers of the world. Socialist Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in the federal penitentiary as a result, and the IWW leader William D. Big Bill Haywood and 99 of his associates were also convicted. Virtually any criticism of the government could be censored or punished. In Schenck versus the United States in 1919, the Supreme Court affirmed the legality of these restrictions and said that freedom of speech could be revoked when such speech posed a clear and present danger to the nation. Prosecutions formed an ugly chapter in the history of American civil liberty. With peace, the presidential pardons were granted, including President Harding's, to Debs in 1921, but there were a few victims who remained in jail into the 1930s. Wilson belatedly backed preparedness measures to forge a wartime economy. Big obstacles confronted the economic mobilizers. some of it was sheer ignorance were among the biggest roadblocks, and no one really knew precisely how much steel or explosive powder the country was capable of producing. Old ideas proved to be liabilities as well, coming along with the traditional fear of big government and the hamstrung effort to orchestrate the economy from Washington. This was a largely voluntary character of the economic war organization. Wilson eventually succeeded in imposing some order in this economic confusion. This is a picture of the socialist leader Eugene V. Debs addressing an anti-war rally in 1918. He ended up going to jail for a time period as a result. The War Industries Board was created in March of 1918 by Bernard Bouch, and this set the precedent for the federal government to take the central role in economic planning in a crisis. Herbert Hoover headed the Food Administration, and this relied on voluntary compliance with propaganda, not compulsory edicts. This had to do with ration cards and things of that nature. So thanks to a wartime spirit, Hoover's voluntary approach worked as farm production increased. Food for thought. This poster shows wartime agencies flooding the country with posters like this. This particular one shows women on the home front encouraging them to grow their own produce and thus ease the pressure on food supplies. Wartime restrictions on foodstuffs for alcohol accelerated the wave of prohibition, and in 1919 the 18th Amendment banned alcohol. Wilson expanded the federal government in size and power to meet the needs of the war. The Wartime Industries Board set the production quotas, allocated the raw materials, and set prices for government purchases. Workers in wartime had the saying that labor will win the war, and American workers sweated their way to the victory. They were driven by the War Department's work or fight rule, which threatened any unemployed male with immediate draft if they chose to strike. And so this was meant to discourage that. The government tried to treat labor fairly during this time period. Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor loyally supported the war, and their loyalty was rewarded as membership doubled for real wages, and real wages for many unionized workers rose by more than 20%. This is a picture called Suppressing the Steel Strike in Homestead, 1919. This had big steel producers ferociously resisting the unionization of their industry, and in Pittsburgh, local officials bent to the steelmakers' will and issued an order banning all outdoor meetings of the strikers. This picture shows the mounted policemen in the Pittsburgh borough of Homestead enforcing the order, basically by beating one of the strikers. The steelworkers' strike eventually failed, leaving the steel industry ununionized until the New Deal championed labor's cause in the Depression decade of the 1930s. The recognition of the right to organize was not won, and workers were hit by wartime inflation. 6,000 strikes broke out in the war years. The industrial workers of the world, often called the Wobblies, engineered damaging industrial sabotage because they were the victims of the shabbiest working conditions. In 1919, the greatest strike in U.S. history rocked the steel industry as more than 250,000 people struck. They wanted the right to bargain collectively, but management still refused to negotiate. Eventually, the steel strike collapsed after more than a dozen strikers were killed, and the setback crippled the union movement for more than a decade. Black workers entered the steel mills in 1919, and tens of thousands of Southern blacks were drawn into the North for war industry employment. There was also interracial violence that resulted, especially in Chicago during this time period, where 15 whites and 23 blacks were killed during what was called the 2 Weeks of Terror in July of 1919. This is the Chicago race riot, and showing a picture of the policemen apparently arriving too late to spare this victim from being pelted by stones by an angry mob. Women were also suffering until suffrage during this time period, and they heeded the call of patriotism and opportunity. Thousands entered factories and fields left by the men who were going to the front line. The war split the women's movement deeply. Many progressive-era feminists were pacifists, but they found a voice in the National Women's Party led by the Quaker activist Alice Paul. They demonstrated against Kaiser Wilson with marches and hunger strikes. The larger part of the suffrage movement was represented by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported Wilson's war, and argued that women must take part in the war effort to earn the role in shaping the peace. The fight for democracy abroad was women's best hope for winning the true democracy at home. So war mobilization gave the new momentum to the suffrage fight. Wilson endorsed suffrage as a vitally necessary war measure. As a result, in 1917, New York voted for suffrage at the state level. This was followed by Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. The whole United States followed, with the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. It was ratified 70 years after the first call for suffrage at the Seneca Falls Convention, and it gave all American women the right to vote. Women's wartime economic gains were fleeting. The Permanent Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor was created to protect women in the workplace, but most women workers gave up their wartime jobs after the war. Congress supported the traditional role as mothers and passed the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act of 1921, which provided federally financed instruction in maternal and infant health care and expanded the responsibility of the federal government for the family welfare. World War I foreshadowed the future when women's wage labor and political power would reshape Americans' way of life. This is a chronology of the women's right to vote in national elections in selected nations. Making plowboys into doughboys was making American soldiers hardy. So America's early role in the war, they did not dream of sending a large force to France. They assumed that a naval power and material support would be enough. But by April and May of 1917, Europeans were running out of money and manpower. So a huge American army needed to be raised, trained, and transported quickly, or the whole Western Front was in danger of collapse. Conscription, or the forced draft, was the only answer to the urgent need. Even though Wilson disliked the draft, he eventually accepted conscription as disagreeable but temporarily necessary. He immediately ran into problems with Congress, who later grudgingly passed conscription. The draft worked effectively overall, and the Army grew to over 4 million men. Women for the first time were admitted to the armed forces as well, 11,000 to the Navy and 269 to the Marines. The Army refused to enlist women at this time. African Americans served in strictly segregated units, usually under white officers, and the military authorities hesitated to train blacks for combat. Thus, the majority were assigned to construction battalions or put to work unloading ships. Recruits were supposed to receive 6 months of training in America and 2 more overseas, but because of the urgency, many doughboys were put more swiftly into battle. In Russia, the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, and they withdrew from the capitalistic war in 1918. This released many Germans from the Eastern Front in Russia for the Western Front in France. France gradually began to bustle with U.S. doughboys or soldiers, and the first ones were used for replacements or deployed in quiet sectors. Into the trenches and to the polls. Wars often bring opportunities and innovations as well as danger and destruction. U.S. Army nurses went into harm's way fighting on the fighting front in France, but basically this helped advance women's suffrage, which intensified on the home front, culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. American soldiers also suffered very high rates of venereal disease as a result of being deployed into Europe, and the American military waged a half-hearted war on the rampant venereal diseases. This map shows major U.S. operations in France, 1918. The massive German drive of the spring of 1918 had the Allies united under the French Marshal Foch. Germans smashed to within 40 miles of Paris in May of 1918, and they threatened to knock France out of the war. 30,000 Americans were sent to Chateau Thierry, right in the teeth of the German advance. This was the first significant engagement of American troops in a European war. The American put decisive weight on the scales to blunt the German drive, and Americans joined also in the Second Battle of the Marne in July. This marked the beginning of the German withdrawal. Americans now demanded and got a separate army, and General John J. Pershing was assigned a front of 85 miles northwestward from the Swiss border to the French line. Pershing's army undertook the Meuse-Argonne offensive. From September 26 to November 11, 1918, the battle lasted for 47 days. It engaged 1.2 million American troops. 120,000 Americans were killed or wounded, but victory of World War I was in sight. Berlin was ready to hoist the white flag, and they looked to Wilson in October 1918 for peace based on his 14 points. Wilson demanded the Kaiser be removed before any armistice could be negotiated, and the war-weary Germans took the hint. The Kaiser fled to Holland, lived for his remaining 23 years, unwept, unhonored, and unhung. The exhausted Germans laid down their arms at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. The cost exceeded comprehension. 9 million soldiers had died. 20 million had suffered grievous wounds. 30 million people died in an influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1919, and more than 550,000 Americans, more than 10 times the number of U.S. combat casualties, died from the flu. The U.S. main contributions to the victory were foodstuffs, ammunition, and credits. Oil for the first mechanized war, and manpower, but not battlefield victories. The Yanks fought only in 2 major battles of World War I, St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, both in the last 2 months of the 4-year war, and they were still fighting in the latter when the war ended. This is a picture called Gassed by John Singer Sargent. This artist captures the horror of trench warfare in World War I. The enemy was often distant and unseen, and death came impersonally from gas or artillery fire. American troops entering the line only in the war's final days were only briefly exposed to this brutal fighting. This figure shows the approximate comparative losses of all the countries in World War I. You can see, by far, Russia exceeded men killed in battle. The United States had the least amount killed in battle because they entered the war so late. And then you can see Russia, followed by Germany and France and Britain and Austria and Italy, as the numbers declined for each country. It was the prospect of the endless U.S. troop reserves rather than America's actual military performance that eventually demoralized the Germans. General Pershing's army had purchased more supplies in Europe than it shipped from the United States, but most of its artillery and virtually all of its aircraft was provided by Britain and France. The United States was not an arsenal of democracy in this war. This is a picture called Home from the War, 1919. Most black troops in World War I were denied combat duty, but were laborers or worked on chain gangs or in some sort of service capacity. But this wounded veteran had seen some tough fighting in a segregated unit, the 369th Colored Infantry Regiment, also known as the Hell Fighters of Harlem. Even when they returned to the United States, segregation followed them. When Congress appropriated money in 1930 to send the Gold Star mothers to visit the graves of their slain soldier sons in France, it also provided for separate ships, hotels, and trains for African American women. Several black mothers preferring to remain at home and retain our honor and self-respect refused to make the trip as a result of the segregation. And we'll continue to talk about the ramifications of the end of the war and how the peace was structured in our next lesson.